Last season, I harvested over 40 pounds of tomatoes from a 12 by 12-foot plot that I had not fertilized with a single store-bought product in 3 years. Not one bag of 10-10-10, not one bottle of liquid feed, not one granule of anything with a brand name on it. The year before I switched methods, that same plot gave me maybe 18 pounds using the conventional fertilizer schedule I had followed for most of my adult life. I was spending more money, doing more work, and getting less than half the harvest. The turning point came during a visit to an Amish homestead outside of Strasburg in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. A farmer named Eli walked me through his kitchen garden, and I could not believe what I was looking at. His tomato plants were chest high and loaded. His bean rows were so thick you could barely see soil between them. His sweet corn was darker green than anything in my garden had ever been. I asked him flat out what fertilizer he used. He looked at me like I had asked what brand of air he breathed. He said, "We feed the soil and the soil feeds the plants. We have always done it this way." That conversation sent me down a path that completely changed my yields and my understanding of what a garden actually needs. Today, I am going to walk you through the exact system Amish gardeners use to double and sometimes triple their crop production without ever buying commercial fertilizer. And stay with me to the end because I will share a simple fall technique I learned from Eli's wife that builds fertility while you sleep, one that I have never seen covered in a single modern gardening book. I want to be honest about where I was before I learned any of this. For over 20 years, I treated my garden like a chemistry experiment. Every spring, I would haul bags of synthetic fertilizer home from the garden center, measure out the recommended rates, scatter it around, and assume I was doing everything right. Some years were decent, some years were disappointing, but I never questioned the system itself. I just figured I needed a different product or a better brand. If you have been doing the same thing, you are not alone. I was right there with you, buying the same bags, reading the same labels, getting the same inconsistent results. Then I started spending time around Amish communities in southeastern Pennsylvania, and what I saw forced me to rethink everything I thought I knew about feeding a garden. Here is the thing you need to understand about Amish families and their gardens. These are not small hobby plots. An Amish household often has 8, 10, sometimes 12 people sitting down to eat every single day. Every row of that garden has a job. Every square foot has to produce. There is no room for a method that kind of works or mostly works. It has to work reliably year after year because people are depending on that food. There is a concept in Amish farming culture tied to the German word Demut, which roughly translates to humility before what already works. The practical meaning is straightforward. You do not try to outsmart a system that has been functioning for thousands of years. You do not replace what the soil already knows how to do. You support it, you strengthen it, and then you get out of the way. Eli put it more plainly. He said, "My grandfather did not buy fertilizer. His grandfather did not buy fertilizer. The soil knows what to do if you keep giving it what it needs." That is not romantic talk. That is a family that has been feeding itself from the same ground for generations because the method works, and the science backs it up completely. Now let me walk you through exactly how they do it, starting with the foundation everything else depends on. The first thing you need to understand is that Amish gardeners do not feed plants. They feed soil. That distinction sounds subtle, but it changes everything about how you approach your garden. When you pour synthetic fertilizer around a tomato plant, you are giving that plant a direct shot of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. The plant uses it quickly. The nutrients wash through the soil with the next rain, and within a few weeks, you are back to square one. Worse, repeated applications of synthetic fertilizer actually suppress the microbial communities in your soil that are responsible for long-term nutrient cycling. You are essentially putting the soil on life support while telling yourself you are helping it. The Amish approach is the opposite. They build a living soil that continuously generates its own fertility, and the primary tool they use is compost, but not just any compost. They use what I would call a layered composting system that combines plant waste and animal manure in specific ways. Here is exactly what to do. In late fall or early spring, spread 3 to 4 inches of well-aged compost across every bed in your garden. If you can source compost that includes aged horse or cow manure, that is ideal. The combination of carbon-rich plant material and nitrogen-rich manure creates an extraordinarily diverse microbial environment. Work this into the top 6 to 8 inches of soil using a garden fork, not a rototiller. Tilling destroys the fungal networks that move nutrients to plant roots. A fork loosens without shredding. Research from Cornell University and Rodale Institute has shown that soils amended annually with compost-containing aged manure produce plants with 30 to 50% higher nutrient uptake compared to synthetically fertilized soils after just 2 to 3 seasons. The microbial activity in compost-fed soil breaks down organic matter into forms that plant roots can absorb slowly and steadily throughout the growing season. It is like the difference between handing someone a candy bar versus cooking them a full meal. One gives a spike and a crash. The other sustains. If you do not have access to animal manure, high-quality homemade compost or bagged compost from a reputable source works well. The key is doing this every single year. The Amish do not treat this as a one-time fix. It is an annual investment that compounds over time. After 2 to 3 seasons, your soil will be visibly different, darker, softer, alive with earthworms. And your plants will show it. For gardeners in zones 3 through 5, get your compost down 3 to 4 weeks before your last frost date so the soil biology has time to activate before transplanting. In zones 7 through 9, a late winter application gives you an even longer runway. Now that your soil foundation is in place, here is where the system starts building on itself. The second thing Amish gardeners do is use what I call targeted manure teas, and this is the closest thing they have to a liquid fertilizer, except it costs nothing, and they make it from materials already on the property. A manure tea is exactly what it sounds like. You steep aged manure in water to extract the soluble nutrients and beneficial microorganisms, then apply it directly to your garden beds. This gives your plants an accessible nutrient boost during peak growing periods, June through August, while simultaneously inoculating the soil with more beneficial bacteria and fungi. Here is the recipe I learned from Eli. Fill a burlap sack or an old pillowcase with about 5 pounds of well-aged cow or horse manure. Tie it closed and suspend it in a 5-gallon bucket of water, like a giant tea bag. Let it steep for 3 to 5 days, stirring it once a day. The water will turn dark brown, roughly the color of weak coffee. That is your manure tea. Dilute it to about half strength, 1 part tea to 1 part water, and apply it around the base of your plants every 2 to 3 weeks during the growing season. Use roughly 1 quart of diluted tea per plant for tomatoes, peppers, and squash. For row crops like beans and lettuce, apply about 1 gallon per 10 linear feet of row. One critical detail: never use fresh manure for this. Fresh manure is too high in nitrogen and can burn plant roots. It can also contain pathogens. The manure must be aged at least 6 months, ideally over a full winter. The Amish compost their manure in large piles through the cold months, and it is ready to use by spring. If you do not have access to aged manure, you can make a similar tea from finished compost using the same method. It will not be quite as nutrient-dense, but it still delivers measurable benefits to both plants and soil biology. I will be straight with you. When I first made this stuff, I thought there was no way a bucket of brown water was going to outperform the precisely formulated liquid fertilizer I had been buying for $15 a bottle. But after 2 seasons of side-by-side testing in my own garden, the manure tea beds consistently outproduced the synthetic beds by a significant margin. The plants were bigger, the fruit set was heavier, and the soil in those beds was noticeably more alive with earthworm activity. If you are finding value in this kind of deep dive into how traditional growers approach the garden, go ahead and hit subscribe. I have a lot more of these coming, pulling from Amish methods and other time-tested growing traditions. All right, let us keep going. This next piece of the system is the one that most modern gardeners skip entirely, and honestly, it might be the most important one of all. Amish gardeners use cover crops between growing seasons to build fertility right in the ground. This is the part that made me rethink my entire off-season routine. Here's what most of us do when the garden is done producing in fall. We pull the dead plants, maybe rake up a bit, and leave bare soil sitting there from October through April. That bare soil is exposed to rain that leaches nutrients downward, wind that carries away topsoil, and cold that kills off microbial life near the surface. By the time spring arrives, your soil is nutritionally weaker than it was at the end of the previous season. You have literally been losing fertility every winter without realizing it. The Amish solve this by planting cover crops, sometimes called green manure, immediately after the main harvest. The most common combination I have seen in Lancaster County is a mix of crimson clover and winter rye, sown together in early to mid-fall, about 4 to 6 weeks before your first expected frost. Here's the setup. After you clear a bed of its summer crops, broadcast crimson clover seed at a rate of roughly 1/4 pound per 100 square feet, mixed with winter rye at about 1 pound per 100 square feet. Rake lightly to get the seeds in contact with soil and water well. That is it. The winter rye grows a dense root system that holds soil in place, prevents erosion, and suppresses weeds. Its roots also exude compounds that break up compacted soil layers. The crimson clover is a legume, which means it partners with soil bacteria to pull nitrogen directly out of the atmosphere and fix it into the soil in a form your plants can use. Free nitrogen, generated by biology, no bag required. In spring, about 3 to 4 weeks before you plant a plant, cut the cover crop down to the soil surface and either turn it under lightly with a fork or lay it on top as a thick mulch. As it decomposes, it releases all those accumulated nutrients directly into the root zone of your next crop. Research from Penn State Extension has documented that a clover and rye cover crop mix can add the equivalent of 40 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre to your soil. For a home garden, that translates to a meaningful and measurable fertility boost every single year without purchasing anything. For gardeners in zones 3 and 4 where fall comes early, get your cover crop seed down by mid-September at the latest. In zones 7 through 9, you can sow as late as early November and still get good establishment before winter. Now here is where the yield multiplication really starts to show itself. The fourth component of the Amish fertility system is strategic crop rotation, and this is the part that ties everything else together. When you plant tomatoes in the same bed year after year, 2 things happen. The tomatoes pull the same specific nutrients from the soil every season, gradually depleting those elements even if you are adding compost. And soil-borne diseases and pests that target tomatoes build up in that location, creating worse problems each year. The Amish avoid this by rotating their crops through a simple 4-year cycle based on plant families. Here's the rotation I have seen used most consistently across multiple Amish communities. Year 1, a bed grows fruiting crops like tomatoes, peppers, and squash. These are heavy feeders that demand a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus. Year 2, that same bed switches to legumes, beans, and peas, which fix nitrogen and actually replenish what the fruiting crops took. Year 3, root crops go in, things like carrots, beets, and potatoes, which break up soil with their deep roots and thrive on the residual nutrients the legumes left behind. Year 4, leaf crops like lettuce, cabbage, and kale, which are moderate feeders and benefit from the well-structured soil that root crops created. Then you start the cycle over. Each crop type sets up ideal conditions for the one that follows it. The fruiting crops deplete, the legumes restore, the root crops restructure, the leaf crops coast on what is there. It is a self-renewing loop. The practical application is simple. Divide your garden into 4 sections. Label them in your mind or on a simple sketch. Assign each section a crop category and advance them 1 position every year. You do not need a complicated spreadsheet. The Amish do this from memory because the logic is intuitive once you understand it. I will admit, I resisted crop rotation for years because I had favorite spots for my tomatoes and I did not want to move them. The result was that my tomato yields dropped a little more each season and I kept blaming the weather or the variety. When I finally committed to a 4-year rotation, my yields recovered within 2 seasons and my blight problems dropped dramatically. Sometimes the hardest part of gardening is getting out of your own way. The 5th and final piece of this fertility system is one that most gardeners have heard of, but very few use correctly, and the Amish approach clarified it for me in a way that years of reading never did. I am talking about mulch, but not as a weed barrier or a decorative layer. The Amish use organic mulch as a slow-release fertility system that feeds the soil continuously throughout the growing season. Once transplants are established and the soil is warmed, spread a layer of straw, old hay, or shredded leaves around your plants to a depth of 3 to 4 inches. Keep the mulch 2 to 3 inches away from plant stems to prevent moisture-related rot. As the mulch decomposes over the summer, it slowly releases nutrients into the topsoil, feeds earthworms and soil microorganisms, and maintains consistent soil moisture levels that help plant roots absorb nutrients more efficiently. The conventional approach is to mulch for weed control and moisture retention, which is fine as far as it goes. But the Amish think of mulch as another layer of fertility being added right through the growing season. At the end of the year, whatever mulch remains gets turned into the soil along with the cover crop, adding even more organic matter. It is a continuous cycle where nothing is wasted and everything feeds back into the system. One practical note: if you use hay as mulch, make sure it has not been treated with persistent herbicides like aminopyralid or clopyralid. These chemicals can survive composting and damage your garden crops, especially tomatoes and beans. Ask your source directly. The Amish grow their own hay and know exactly what is in it, but if you are buying hay, this is an important question to ask. Now let me walk through a few patterns I have noticed that keep gardeners from getting the most out of their soil, myself included, for far too long. The first pattern is the fertilizer dependency cycle. You use synthetic fertilizer, your plants respond quickly, you assume it is working, but over time your soil biology weakens because the microbes that cycle nutrients naturally have nothing to eat. So you need more fertilizer to get the same results. The Amish break this cycle by feeding the biology, not bypassing it. The second pattern is bare soil over winter. I did this for 15 years and never thought twice about it. I just assumed the garden rested in winter. It does not rest. It erodes, it leaches, it loses structure. A cover crop turns your off-season from a period of decline into a period of active improvement. It took me seeing Amish fields green with clover in November while my bed sat bare and muddy to realize how much I was leaving on the table. The third pattern is treating each season as a fresh start. Most of us think about fertility in annual terms. What do I need to add this year? The Amish think in cycles: what did last year's crop leave behind, and what does this year's crop need? When you connect your seasons through rotation, cover cropping, and continuous composting, each year builds on the one before instead of starting from scratch. The fourth pattern is underestimating mulch. We think of it as something that sits on top of the soil and looks tidy. The Amish see it as the top layer of a living system, something that is actively being consumed and converted into fertility while it does its job on the surface. Once I started thinking of mulch as food instead of decoration, I started applying it more generously and more consistently. Now, here is the technique I promised you at the beginning, the one I learned from Eli's wife, Martha, on that same Lancaster County visit. After the main garden harvest is finished, but before they plant cover crops, Martha walks through the garden with a bucket of wood ash saved from their kitchen stove throughout the year. She scatters a thin layer, roughly half a pound per 100 square feet, evenly across each bed and rakes it lightly into the surface. Wood ash is rich in potassium and calcium, two nutrients that fruiting crops like tomatoes and peppers pull heavily from the soil during the growing season. It also raises soil pH slightly, which is beneficial in the naturally acidic soils common across much of the eastern United States. Martha told me her mother did it and her grandmother before that. They noticed that beds treated with fall ash produced noticeably better crops the following summer. The timing matters. Applying ash in fall gives it the entire winter to break down and integrate into the soil chemistry. Applying it in spring can raise pH too quickly and interfere with early season planting. And you need to keep the quantity modest. Too much ash pushes pH too high and can lock out micronutrients. Half a pound per 100 square feet once a year is the sweet spot. Do not use ash from treated lumber, charcoal briquettes, or anything that might contain chemicals. Only use ash from clean hardwood. Oak, maple, and hickory ash are ideal. Softwood ash like pine works, but has lower nutrient content. I started doing this 3 falls ago, and my soil test results the following spring showed measurable increases in both potassium and calcium without any additional amendment. It takes 10 minutes, costs nothing, and it is the kind of quiet, practical technique that does not make headlines but makes a real difference over time. That is the complete system I learned from Amish gardeners for doubling crop production without store-bought fertilizer. Build your soil with compost every year. Supplement with homemade manure tea during the growing season. Plant cover crops every fall to generate free nitrogen and protect soil structure. Rotate your crops on a 4-year cycle so each planting sets up the next. Mulch as a living fertility layer throughout the summer. And scatter wood ash in fall to replenish what the season took. None of this is complicated. None of it is expensive. It just requires a shift in thinking from feeding plants with products to building soil with biology. Once I made that shift, my garden changed in ways I did not think were possible after 30 years of doing it the other way. If any part of this changed how you think about garden fertility, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what you have been doing, what you plan to try, and how it works out. And if you want more of these explorations into how traditional growers get exceptional results with simple methods, hit subscribe. There is a lot more to share. Thanks for spending time with me today. I will see you in the next one.